This is a question that's been outstanding a while. How do you identify the different types of dendrobiums? That question's not that easy to answer, but I'll have a go. I mean, obviously I haven't got dendrobiums in all the different types, but I've got a fair variety. Dendrobiums are a very large genus, one of the largest, I think second only to bulbophyllums, but bulbophyllums are getting split now, so maybe one day the dendrobiums will be the biggest. But as a consequence of they were divided into sections, and the sections to a degree not only describe the look but also the care. But there will be exceptions, so you can't go on a generalisation so bland as that. The first section are the Phalaenanthe. Now this is what we call the Phalaenopsis type dendrobiums, the phal types, you know, names. And I happen to have one sticking out here in bloom. The blooms do look similar to a Phalaenopsis, but not. The lip is nothing like a Phalaenopsis lip, but as a general look, they have a look about them that's a bit Phalaenopsis. That particular section is typified by the Bigibum, or Biggie Bum as I like to call it, an Australian one, and most of those do come from either northern Australia or out into the islands, you know, the Malaysias, Philippines, stuff like that, around those areas. These are recognised by having small to large canes. They do vary, but they do tend to grow quite tall, and their canes are roughly the same thickness over the whole length in the main, although some are a bit thinner at the base. All the leaves are at the top of the cane, no matter how long the cane is, and they vary from half a dozen to just a couple, depending on the age of the plant. The spikes come out initially from the top. Yeah, the first spike is highly likely to be straight out of the apex, and sometimes two, and then they can bloom from farther down. This one bloomed straight out the top, and now it's produced two new spikes lower down. Spikes come out either from the apex or at the base on the top of a leaf lower down. That's their general look. They are quite easy to spot. They can be very floriferous. I've seen spikes with like 30 blooms on that are 2 foot long and absolutely covered. So that's that particular group. Care for those, a generalisation again, but they shouldn't get cold. They are by nature a continuous grower if kept in the right conditions. It is, oh, hang on, the kit's fired up. Let me just turn that off for a minute. That means Hurricane Hector may be due to fire up in a minute. I'll get that when it happens. But generally speaking, these come from areas where they don't get cold. And under normal circumstances, they can push out new growths almost any time. But like I've said with a lot of orchids, they will have a period where they're doing nothing. They're not producing any new growths or new roots. The canes that they've got are finished growing. They're not blooming. That's the time when you're liable to mess your root systems up by overwatering or giving them too much water and keeping them wet. Yeah, when they're in active growth, feed and water well. Somebody asked me to explain that once. Well, to me it's obvious, but maybe it's not. But that's another thing. So that's that section. Don't let them get cold. They don't really need seasonal periods. They can be growing at any time, and if they're growing, feed and water well. Some of them are a bit sulky if you repot them at the wrong time, and like all orchids, you know, if you've got a nice set of new roots growing and you think you might need to repot it sometime down the line, get on and do it while those new roots are there, because it might not produce any more for a year or more. So grab it while you can. So that's that lot. The spatulata section, this is basically the antelope types, and I've only got a couple, and then they're not typical. In general, they look quite similar to the Phalaenopsis type, and it's difficult to actually say exactly what they should look like. But generally speaking, they tend to have canes that are quite narrow at the bottom and a bit wider in the middle, but not all. I mean, this is my only... this one here, that's an antelope type. It's called black antelope. It's all in the name, you know. I nearly lost this. It lost all its leaves last year in the heat wave. Suffered badly. So at the start of this year, I had 5 leafless canes and some dying leaves on the top of the only cane with leaves on. It's recovering now. I've got 3 nice new growths pushing on there. 3, or is it 4? 3. And it looks like they're going to grow okay. But they do have a similarity. I would say the only difference is that as the leaves progress downwards from the top, they tend to get a bit smaller, and they'll often have an odd one, just a little one. The first one coming up from the bottom. But then not that easy to identify. They certainly are once they bloom. You can't mistake an antelope type bloom. Gorgeous. Right, that's those. Typical ones in there, you've got Antenatum, discolor, straight. I can't even say that one. I did write these down, but I scribbled them. I can't even read my own writing. I should have been a doctor, shouldn't I? Stroites, I think that is. Straiootes. Anyway, there are some typical ones, but Antenatum is probably the one you're going to come across most often. Now that's that lot. Then there is a section in the Dendrobiums called Dendrobium. So it's a dendrobium. Don't ask whoever thought that up. It's a daft one. It may well be that those were the ones that were left behind and not put into a section. And because all the others had a section name, they had to have a section name. So they were Dendrobiums. It's a bit daft. They come into 2 categories. They need a winter rest, these type, but there's 2 types. There's one type that really do need chilling down, you know, down to as low as possibly even 5 degrees C. They do need a really good chill. And the ones that are in there are the actual species, Dendrobium Nobile. Yeah, that one needs a good chill down, or you'll get little or no blooming at all. In that group, you've got Friedrichianum, my one, and the Nobile species. But don't get confused with the Nobile hybrids. They would not come into section 1. The hybrids don't need that level of chill, but the species does. And then section 2, again, needs the winter rest, but not as cold. That's the only difference, really. They need exactly the same treatment. And the ones in that sort of group are the Anosmum, Findlayanum, and the one that's called typical of type. It's got a special name, Moniliform. My one up here is not doing very well at the moment. This is, in fact, a cool grower all year round. So, oh, here we go. Let me just get at Hurricane, and I shall get wet legs. See, what's happened was that little short break that you thought I had was actually quite a long break, so the sun's getting round here now. Duh. Right, so where did I get to? Dendrobium moniliform. Now mine isn't growing very well because it's a cool grower, but it is producing some new growth. It's having a try, and the latest 2 canes are growing on. I'm not sure they're going to get much bigger. They look like they've finished. So they haven't grown as big as they should have done, but what they have done is produced a much better root system. So the plant should now get going a bit better. Again, when did that suffer? In the heat last year. Is it still suffering? Yes, we've just had another load of heat, haven't we? So the cool growers don't do so well for me. So that's that lot. The Kalista section, this is where Lindleyi fit, yeah, and the Jenkinsii and Farmeri fit into that category. And we'll have a look at one of those in a minute. That's my treat for the end. So you'll have to stay till the end if you want to see it. I know this is getting long. But Chrysotoxum's in that section. That's the monster behind that spike. That thing with the new canes coming out left, right and centre. So yeah, they're not easy to recognise, quite honestly. I mean, if you think of how big Jenkinsii is and then think how big that plant is, and yet they're in the same section. So sometimes you really do have to go down to plant level and look up the care shape and size for the plant. It's not always obvious which section they actually go in. So that's that lot. The Latourias, somebody actually asked, how are my Latourias doing? Recovering slowly is a generalised statement, and it is pretty generalised as well. I've got one that is dead. I still keep it and I still water it, but that's dead. The only new growth it tried to grow stalled. It tried to grow some new roots. They just died back. So that's dead. And I don't know what it is. It was one of those, I was waiting for it to bloom to find out what it was, if you see what I mean. The others, they've all been taken down away from the roof now. It's too hot up there for them, and the light's too bright. They don't need the high light, the Latouria types. Right, I've got another little one here. This one's coming back to life. It's pushed up a new cane with some new leaves, and there's a bud in it. And it's now producing some new roots because the roots weren't too happy, and some of the older roots are branching out. So recovering slowly. It will get there. No problem with that one. Don't ask which one it is. As I said, they all got mounted, taken out of pots where they stayed far too wet in the winter, and didn't get tagged. So until they bloom, I don't know. This one is sort of recovering, but if you look at that little new growth, centre shot now, the leaves have died. Yeah? And yet on some of the older canes, the leaves are hanging in there. This is a mix. I'm not quite sure what's going on, but it keeps pushing out some new growth. Some have failed, but what it's now doing is another little new growth at the base there, having another try. It keeps trying, and it is growing some roots. So it will make it. It's more likely to make it towards the autumn when it just cools down that little bit to encourage it to go. And then we've got another one here. Now this one's again trying hard. It keeps pushing up new growths, but they're not getting to full size, and some of the leaves are getting brown ends to them. It's lack of humidity. It's got to be. And up in the roof, that's going to be the driest, warmest area, isn't it? So getting it down out of the roof should now give these newer ones a chance. But this one's trying hard. Don't know which one it is. So coming on, I would say, trying, getting better. But these were, in the main, good plants once, and that heat wave last year and lack of humidity just did them in. And I think they got too much light as well where they were. So that's those. And there is one still in a pot over here, which is Alexandre. Now this one has kept its leaves, but so far this year it hasn't grown a new growth. The one that it produced back in the winter just aborted. So now Latouria types, they are typically very narrow at the base, and they stay quite narrow, and then they get a fat bit near the top. And they have several leaves at the top. Anything from 2 to probably 4, maybe 5, but not many, and they'll all be right at the top of the cane. The older canes often take on an orangey look, and in some cases they can get black marks, which is a bit worrying, and if there's any sign of sogginess, it is a worry. Get rid of it. Yeah. These are very prone to getting root rot, and the reason is they're wet when they're not growing. So these don't need a proper rest, and they shouldn't get cold. In here they get cold in the winter, too cold for them, and in a pot they stayed too wet. They just weren't using the water, they weren't growing. Yeah. So I've learnt my lesson with the Latourias. For me, in my environment, with my winter temperatures, they're going to do better on amount, where I can keep my eye on the amount of water. And also they are quite prone to rotting around the base. They need clearance around their base. Don't pot them in, pot them on. If you're going to put them in a pot, sit them on top so that there's almost an airflow around the base of the plant. Yeah, keep them warm, don't let them get cold. If they're going to get cold, they'll stall, they'll stop growing, and at that point go very easy on the water. They're not high feeders either, but They also don't need bright light like some dendrobiums do. I mean, I've suffered both with the soggy bottom, too much light, not enough humidity, you name it, my poor Latourias have suffered from it. Lessons learnt, yes, but time taken to recover the plants, and not all of them will. I've already thrown one out, I know, and one's on its way soon. So that's the Latouria types. They do have a look about them, and it's mainly typified by those narrow, very narrow starts to the canes, and the fat part of the cane is at the top, like a swelling. Yeah, that sort of typifies those. But yeah, don't let them get cold. The Formoseae section are the black hair types. Now I've got some up here. Now these are, in the Latourias, Macrophyllum and Spectabile are classed as the ones that you're most likely to come across. Obviously there's loads of hybrids. And are typical to the look, to the form. Right, where did we get to, Latourias? Formoseae, this is the black hair type. I have a selection of these, literally, relatively recently. This little collection seems to have grown a bit. Now, I got the Frosty Dawn, whoops, I was going to say these are going now, they are going to fall, one already has. Frosty Dawn I got back in our 60th show, so that was, what was that, end of March. Massive trauma for the plant. That came from Thailand, where it was grown, you know, and that had to travel, packed in a case, like a coffin, and arrived in a totally alien environment, and then got bought and brought back here to yet a totally different environment. I was expecting it to suffer, and it has. It's dropped some leaves. It's pushing out an odd bud here on a very old cane. It's now started to grow. It has got its first new growth pushing on, and some roots to go with it. So it will make it, but it will take a year or two to get back to its glory. But this one and this one have both got infundibulum in them, and that really typifies the black hair type. If it's got infundibulum in it, it's going to have very large, I mean these are going now so they're not typical, but pretty large white flowers with some form of yellowy gold in the lip to some degree. Incredibly long lasting. This is the bonus. The blooms on the black hair types normally last a long time. When the canes are young, you can see where they get their name from. The little black hairs are obvious, but as the canes age, they not only become less obvious, but they disappear. So you end up without the black hair type. These tend to start their new growth very fat and get thinner, but as the canes mature, it evens out. You get leaves over the entire length of the cane, so if it wasn't for the black hairs, they'd look a little bit like Nobile hybrids. You know, alternate leaves up the cane, yeah? Followed terminal leaf. They do have a similarity. They do tend to have darker leaves than Nobiles though, but the telltale sign is the black hairs when the growth is young, yeah? So that's 3 of those. And believe it or not, that's a black hair type, Mr. Hairy, and that's got greyish white hairs on it. But again, it's still typical of form. Alternate leaves and hairy canes. So that's a black hair type, believe it or not. It's in that section. So that's those. This one's an exception because this needs a bit of a rest in the winter. If you rest that too hard, it may well die. It's not a true winter rester. As for the majority of the black hair type, they're the same as the other dendrobiums. When they're actively growing, feed and water well. When they're not, don't. It really applies to all orchids, doesn't it? I can't say it often enough. Don't keep a plant that's not growing soggy. You're liable to lose your root system. And this one is very susceptible to just keeling over for no apparent reason. I suspect 9 times out of 10 it's just too wet at a time when it's cooler and it's not growing. It's the most likely cause. It does need to cool down a bit in the winter. This one, not those, yeah. And with these, more like Latourias than anything else. They don't like to get cold, generally speaking, certainly not down low temperatures anyway. And look after them when they're growing. Get those canes nice and big. Don't let them stall. So that's the black hair type for Mossier. Generally speaking, they are cooler growers than other Dendrobium types, but not cold. There's a difference between a cooler grower. It just means it comes from higher up. That's generally all it is. It's a higher elevation grower. And typical ones in there are Formosum, Infundibulum, as I've already said, and Lowii, and this one, Senili. This one turns up to buy now and again. A lot of people take it home and kill it, unfortunately. It's a difficult one, that, whereas the others aren't too bad. This one's got scale at the moment. I'm working on it. They're on the old cane in under the sheaths. These are dead. They have been got at. But every now and again a live one or couple turn up. And what I don't want is them getting on the new canes. So yeah, so that's the common sections, the 6. Valianthe, the fowl types. Yeah. Spatulata, that's the antelope types. Dendrobium, in which you've got 2 groups, the very cold winter resters and the not so cold winter resters. Kalista, that's the Lindleyi, Jenkinsii and stuff like that. The Latourias, many and lovely hybrids in amongst those. Macrophyllum and Spectabile are the ones that are chosen to be typical of what the look is like. If you can get hold of Spectabile, boy does that look like an alien bloom. They are stunning, and a well-grown plant of that will take a show any day. It's just so unusual. And then the Formosae, which is the black hair types. Those are the 6 main sections. There are dozens and dozens of other sections, and some sections have only got 1 Dendrobium in them, and you're highly unlikely to come across them. Right, I'm just going to put the camera down. I've got one last thing to show you. Right, ending on a good note. A couple of weeks ago in a video we noticed that there was a spike starting. Not that many days ago we looked at the spike with the buds forming, and in a few days we now have a completely open spike. Now this is Farmeri crossed with Griffithianum, so this is in the Kalista section, often typified by odd shapes to the canes. Now these canes have like a square cross section if they weren't so desiccated, but yeah, they're not rounded. They have concave elements to them. So these canes have got 4 sides, each one slightly concave. That's not typical of all of them, but a fair few. Yeah, and with these you will get a spike push out from a node on consecutive years often. So just because a cane's bloom once, that's not the end of it. It can bloom another 2 or 3 times, and sometimes 2 spikes at once. But the development of the spikes is the fastest spike I know in the orchid world. From starting a node moving to being in full bloom can be as short as 2.5, 3 weeks. They are fast. They grow at a hell of a rate. They're also typified, certainly on this one with Farmeri in it. The blooms open virtually all at once. Within 2 days, the whole spike's open. Yeah? And the other typical thing about them is they don't flipping last long. Well, these don't anyway, with Farmeri. This is Farmeri crossed with Griffithianum. And this was getting in a bit of a sorry state when I potted it up. I cut a lot of the old plant off. But it's just getting going again now. It's got a new growth. And some new roots starting up this end of the plant. The oldest part of the plant I doubt is going to do much, and it had a very poor root system which it's now trying to replace. So yeah, end on a good note. Very attractive flowers, very short-lived. You're lucky to get 2 weeks out of them. It's more likely to be about 10 days. But when they bloom, they're a show. You know, when you get a well-grown plant of this with 7 or 8 spikes all round the edge of the plant hanging over like that, it's a showstopper, as many of the Dendrobiums are. Anyway, just thought I'd end on that. So that's a very long, probably, Sunday morning chat, and I'll just end on the Vandas because they're down at the moment. We rarely get to look at these closely because they're always up in the roof. This is the big purple one. This is about the size the blooms open. And that's about the size they grow to. The blooms themselves grow, on this one anyway. Very, very attractive blooms, absolutely stunning. And that camera on my screen is showing that virtually blue. It isn't, it's purple. But it's close. And the patterning is gorgeous, and that deep purple lip, smashing one. And the little orange one, that's opened up pretty well now. Colour changes, it's a browny colour when they open. You can see there, like a browny tinge to it, bronzy tinge. And then as they open, they become a nicer orange, brighter orange, I'll say. This, although I don't know the name of it, is an Ascocentrum, which is Ascocenda crossed with Vanda. And Ascocenders have been reclassified as Vandas, so there's no such thing as Ascocentrum anymore. Nonetheless, very attractive, bought for me by my daughter. 2 spikes on the go at the moment. Blooms 2, often 3 times a year, that one. And this one normally blooms twice, depending on how late in the year the first spike comes out. Last year it had a spike that opened late autumn and went into winter. They lasted ages because it had cooled right down. But the plant wasn't happy, it was too cold. There we go then, big long Sunday chat with all sorts included, and crossed a hell of a lot off my list, which I'm pleased about. You'll all have to think of some new ideas won't you? See you next time. Thanks for dropping by.